The first step is the building part. And the main thing we want to focus on when it comes to building is the concept of minimum viable product. You've probably heard the term MVP before. And the place where people mess up the most is the minimum part. So kind of the first kind of core tenet of minimum viable product is do just one thing. So when you're, especially if you're a more junior engineer and you're doing this thing on the side, you cannot build like some huge grand product, like a Facebook or Airbnb right off the bat. It is just not possible. You have to work within your means, and you also want to set yourself up for success. And you do that by solving a very specific problem with an extremely high amount of quality and focus. And when you do that, it makes it a lot easier for you to kind of understand the problem and understand kind of the user experience after you launch it. And like, okay, does this experience actually feel good? It's much easier to do that when you're only doing one specific thing. If you launch an app that does 20 different things, like you don't know where users are struggling. Like it'll be really difficult. Like, are they struggling on feature 1 or feature 15? So I actually recommend having as few features as possible when you launch your V1. And this is a bit counterintuitive because everyone wants to have like a bunch of features. They see all these like fancy apps they use in their day-to-day that have like a million features, a million screens. You do not want to do that for V1, especially with a personal project, especially if you are a more junior engineer. And kind of adding on to this reflects one of the core concepts that Rahul and I have talked about a lot when it comes to being a good software engineer is you value depth over breadth. Depth is hard to get because most engineers, when it comes to the resources, it's really easy to build breadth, right? Like it's really easy to build some proficiency in Node.js and then in Android and iOS and web and, machine learning even is kind of commoditized. You can find some tutorial on YouTube and you can just follow tutorials for all of them and be like, oh yeah, I've gone something to work in all these stacks before, right? But very few people can go deep on one thing and make something that's like really high quality and like really understand the ins and outs of that stack. And how the product ideation process works is work backwards from what you want to do and build your product. And then after you have like, okay, this is what I think will accomplish this one problem I'm trying to solve, cut as many features as you can because there's a good chance that there's actually some features that you don't need. And then once you just keep paring it down, once it fails to solve that one specific thing, then you can revert your last change and boom, that's kind of like your V1. And to make this more concrete, here are some features that you might not need in your V1, which is something that Rahul and I have seen on a lot of personal projects because we have a side projects channel in Slack with around 5,000 members where people share their projects. And we have seen people have these in their V1s and we really don't think they need them. So I think the number one kind of violator is onboarding process and like user accounts. Like, I don't think folks understand the complexity of having these things. And oftentimes you don't need them. Like, because if you really think about it, you only really need accounts if you want to like connect people to other people or services. And if you need like this concept of cloud syncing, where if you sign in on one device, you can log in on another device and then the data is synced. A lot of the times you can build a utility app where it can just live purely on whatever device they're using, either their computer and web browser or their mobile phone, and then have value. And like there's just so much stuff that comes with building a good onboarding for accounts because like there's third-party login, there's like all these different types of different protocols. You're running into like data compliance concerns like the EU's GDPR. Like you have to make sure that you don't get hacked, and then you're hashing the passwords. And then if you're doing the email password flow, which a lot of tutorials and boot camps seem to like to have you build, you need to forget password flow, and you need to enforce like uniqueness of the username, and then ideally some password strength as well. There's all this stuff you have to do, right? And it's just really not worth it. Kind of adding on to this, the most common reason you build a server side is to kind of support this concept of login and user accounts. So if you remove that, you generally don't even need a backend. If you look at most of my apps, they don't have a backend because again, the backend adds a lot of complexity. Like once you have a backend, you probably have a database. The database is hackable. A database can also just die to be able to back it up. The network complexity adds a lot of kind of tricky code to your front end. What if the API call is slow? What if the API call fails? You have to handle all of that. And then if you're a junior engineer, you can easily get overwhelmed trying to build a polished product that has, also that is actually full stack, like front end and back end. And the last one, which we've also seen on a lot of kind of personal projects, is the idea of building a marketplace, like a marketplace product. A marketplace product is where you need a bunch of content on it in order to have value or other users. So if you look at Facebook, it's kind of the classic marketplace product, because you need, in order for Facebook to have value, you need a bunch of users on it already sharing a lot of content, because no one wants to go to a social network with just one person. It's like no one wants to go to a party with just themselves, right? But then you have this vicious cycle problem where it's like users only want to join Facebook when there's already other users. But what about those other users? They also only want to join when there's already other users, right? So something has to give initially. And if you're doing a side project, junior dev, oftentimes you won't be able to solve that problem. That is extremely difficult to solve, and it's not an engineering problem.
Yeah, one way that we framed this in the past, which I really like, is level 1, 2, and 3 projects. So level 1 are just local utility apps. And the vast majority of the things that Alex and I have built that have actually been able to get traction and add value to people have been level 1. They're just things that you do on your phone because they solve a particular problem. And that's really where I'm hoping we can convince you there's still a ton of untapped opportunity in that domain. Level 2 is where you now start having integration. So okay, I'm going to talk to the Yelp API and integrate that. I'm going to add in some sort of authentication flow. Now your product is much more complicated. You might have some requirements to mandate, like to be able to do certain things, certain actions, allow users to delete things. Like all these additional features then start cropping up because you have these integrations. And now you have to also worry about maintenance, right? Like what if the API is down? How do you handle that? A lot more issues around error handling and graceful, being able to do things gracefully in the app. And the third level, which I really feel strongly, please do not do this. Like building out an Uber or Airbnb type thing, which is like Alex described, it's like a chicken and egg problem. You're really not going to be able to get traction in the app unless you are able to convince people of the value, right? And these are almost always not actually technical problems. These are operational problems. You have to like be able to convince drivers and riders to be able to download the app, have enough supply and demand to match them up. All these things happen with the marketplace. You really don't want to be doing anything in that, especially if you're doing this as a personal thing and you're not full-time on it. So I think this framing is really important. And the one thing I wanted to add in here before we move on to the next slide is that I think people sometimes feel uncomfortable when we give them the feedback that, hey, you're doing something too complicated. You have to simplify it drastically. And people have this itch, or like they have this really deep desire, like, no, that's like the whole point of this is I want to make something really complicated and cool. And my advice there is that's fine. Like the ambition being really this huge project, that's actually okay, but you need to start with something simple. And one tactical thing that I would recommend is to start doing project planning. So basically, think about phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of your project and break it down and make phase 1 really, really dead simple. And everything else, like, okay, I'm going to add in these integrations. I'm going to have this interactive UI, which is going to be like super novel. All that will come in. You can plan it out in phase 2 and phase 3. And I would recommend that you actually write it down. I think a lot of the anxiety that people have about making it simple is like, oh, what if I forget, or what if I, never get to it? That's where you can actually leverage things like GitHub issues. So when Alex and I work together, we are really heavy users of GitHub issues as our primary source of project planning, right? And it doesn't really matter what you use, GitHub issues or Asana or a Google Doc. Just put something in writing where you can say, hey, here's what we have planned now. Here's what, once we have high quality and we're happy with what we've built here, we're going to move on to this and this and this. That way, you're not letting go of your vision, but it's just a question of when you get to it.